Tammy said I wasn't on. Maybe I am on now for Facebook. We'll see. Technology's great. I get round up in teaching and forget the technology sometime.
Yeah, I just want to point this out in regards to what the translators were thinking. The translators have a technique that when they use a pronoun or a descriptive word to describe the Messiah or God, they capitalize.
They capitalize it.
Not necessarily scriptural, but it's what they do.
Right.
Angel here is not capitalized.
Right.
So they didn't think that it was a reference.
It is in some translations. See, once again, we're back into the realm of humans, right? We're back in the realm of humans, and it's just little peaks, right? And this angel that's dealing with Sarah here and later, we're going to see the same angel of the Lord show up 2 or 3 times in Abraham's life. This angel of the Lord is doing what Jesus the Christ did, and that is he's making plain to humans and to God's chosen people what God's decisions and what his commands are. And so whether you call that an angel or a messenger, whatever you call that, that's what it is. That's one of the jobs of angels. That's one of the things that we have in common with angelic beings, is that it's our job to represent God. It's our job to speak his words. It's our job to live his deeds. We're to be his hands. We're to be his feet. And in the spiritual realm, that's what the beings we call angels do. It just so happens that there's a whole bunch of different kinds of angels, and sometimes they do the form of being a messenger, and sometimes they don't. And we in English give them all this umbrella name of angels. And so it can be kind of confusing. But the point is the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that was beside the road to Shur, and he said, Hagar, slave of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? We talked about this last week. God and God's messengers, especially his heavenly messengers, don't ask questions they don't already know the answer to. God doesn't ask questions because he needs the knowledge. When he went looking for Adam and Eve in the garden, he says, where are you? He knew where they were. He wasn't asking for the knowledge. He was asking to impress on them to think about where they were and why they were doing what they were doing. When Jesus asks questions, he's not asking questions to know knowledge. He's asking questions to be what we would call like a Socratic method of teaching, where you ask questions and people think through their minds the answer to those questions, and they come up with their own teaching, their own answer, their own understanding of the truth. That's what God does. He's like a good lawyer. A good lawyer never asks a question, especially in a courtroom, that he doesn't already know the answer to. He doesn't want to hear anything new. Objection, objection. Move to be stricken from the record. Why do they do that? Because you can't, as a lawyer, you can't handle things that are unknown, and God doesn't. There's nothing that's unknown for God. Yeah, Roy.
Last week we were talking about the angels watching God create.
Yeah.
And they cheered because they didn't know what was coming. So
Yeah.
this angel asked those 2 questions. He asked, where are you coming from, where are you going? So would God have already had to give them that information?
Possibly. See, once again, it just doesn't tell us. But the angel already knew. The angel came looking for her and found her and is asking this question, where are you? Where did you come from and where are you going? See, he already knew. Now, it doesn't mean that this angel knew everything about everyone in every place. But just think about the things that you know because you're a child of God that other people who don't have a relationship with God don't know. They could know. Maybe they choose not to know. But there's things you know that others don't know. In fact, the book of Hebrews says there's things that you know and think are just everyday, ordinary stuff that angels long to look into. They scratch their heads and say, what's that? I don't know. I don't understand. I truly believe we've got angel friends we'll meet someday. We'll have conversations with them. I want to find out, was that time that I didn't get hurt, but I should have got hurt? Was that just good luck? Or was that a protective angel looking out for me? And there's an angel somewhere that knows the answer to that question. Angels may ask us things like, I just don't get it. How can you be wrong so often and God still forgive you and love you? See, it wasn't angels that Jesus died on the cross for. It was human beings. The plan of salvation, redemption, is for humans, not for angelic beings. In fact, the place that the Bible calls hell was not created for humans. It was created for angels that rebelled against God. Now, you can go there if you want to, but it wasn't made for you. It wasn't the reason that it was created. And so there's all these little facets that we see about these angels. And he asked Sarah, "Where'd you come from?" And she says, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarah." Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant, and I will give birth to a son, or you will give birth to a son. You will call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, everyone's hand against him. He will live in hostility towards his brothers." Verse 13, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me," she says, "for I have now seen the one who sees me." I think that's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful description. If you're a Christian, you now know the God who knew you. It's just, to me, that's just a beautiful thing. You have a relationship with the God that sought you out. You have a position in his family that he chose and set aside specially for you. Now, you had the choice. You could choose not to. You could still choose not to. But it's so cool to be in relationship with a God that we get glimpses of, we get pieces of understanding of, when from the very beginning he has already understood us. He's already known us. And to me, that's a very, very encouraging thing. So that's why the well was called Bir Leha Roy. It's still there between Kadesh and Bered. I don't know if that well is still there today, but it was still there when this was written. And we won't get into that distinction right now. So Hagar bore Abram a son. Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. And we get this little peek. So what are some of the things we learn about angels from this little encounter? Let's don't talk about slavery. We could talk about that for 3 weeks and we'll still wind up at the same spot. Yeah, Bruce?
Yeah, I want to make this comment because she said that she thought she had seen God. Mm-hmm. And in other places in the Old Testament, there were people who thought they had seen God. Mm-hmm. If you go to John chapter 1, verse 18, it says, "No man has seen God at any time."
Right.
So what she saw was an angel. She didn't see God.
Yeah, it's the Hebrew text actually says she saw the backside of God. What does that mean? I don't know. But it's kind of in there what you're talking about. No man can see. Same thing with Moses. Moses wanted to see God's face, and God says, "Nobody can see my face and live. But I'll put my hand over you, and you can see my backside," whatever that means. You can see my glory. Is another place he's, I don't know. But you're right. It's somehow, some way, it took a intermediary between the God on his throne and the runaway slave. And God chose, in his sovereignty as the king, to do it this way with this being called the angel of the Lord. And whether we ever understand it or not, doesn't matter. Because God's God. He can do what he wants to do, right? He can do it the way he wants to do it. He doesn't need our permission or even our understanding. But it's kind of cool that we see these little pictures here. What do you learn about angels from this?
It seemed like this angel was definitely not frightened.
No.
Because she wasn't frightened by him at all.
No.
Most of the angels that show up
Yes.
cause people to fall down.
Yes, we're going to see that as we look at these encounters in the Old Testament. There's two ways that angels show up in their interaction with humans. One is what the book of Hebrews calls entertaining angels unaware. That is, sometimes angels appear, they take on the form of just a regular human. And people think they're just dealing with another human being. Other times they present themselves in their full angelic appearance, and you find entire armies being destroyed, and Roman soldiers hardened Roman soldiers at the grave, falling over in just stunned. The first words when they do that, their first words are always, "Don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid." Why? Because when they show themselves in their true form, there's something about it that strikes terror deep within human beings. And so what do they look like? I don't know. There's sometimes some phrases that describe them, talk about beings of light, beings of power, beings of immense, sometimes size even. But I've seen big people before I wasn't afraid of. Back in the day, when I had trouble with my anger, my temper, if a guy's bigger than you, you just punch him before he punches you. And hope for the best. Sometimes you get whipped and sometimes you don't. But that's, I don't know what that means. I just know that there's something about angels that when they appear common, people treat them as if they're just another person. And sometimes they do something or they say something that causes people to say, whoa, wait a minute, this is not normal. This is not just another kind of a deal. And so at some point in this encounter, you have to kind of read between the lines here, but at some point in this encounter, Hagar went from not being afraid of this guy on the road that she met to going back to a situation she had run away from so that she could be obedient to God. And so that's one of the things we can learn about angels from this story, is that angels are not only messengers from God, they're also encouragers and enablers from God. In other words, it's not just the angel saying, okay, this is what God said, now I'm done. Now, sometimes angels do that. In fact, there's a couple places where he says, now I've said what God said to tell you, I'm gone, and they're gone. And the guy's going, wait, and they're gone. We'll look at those. Daniel was one of those times. Something caused her to change from being a lady of rebellion to a lady of submission and obedience. And the crucial pivot point in that was this angel called the angel of the Lord. That's what messengers of God do. And by the way, that's your job as a Christian too. The whole idea of being salt and light, when Jesus says you give a cup of cold water, it won't go unnoticed. The reason we do all those things is because we want to become the fulcrum point that causes someone else to change the way they live, to change the way they think, to change the way they act, to change the way they speak. And we do so by being God's messengers with our lives and with our words and with our actions and with how we do things and with how we treat people. And some people won't change their rebellion and some people will. And you never really know which one it's going to be. And so angels, here in this case, you've got an angel of the Lord that brings a message from God to this homeless runaway slave. And that's the other thing we can learn from this story about angels, is that these powerful beings that have access to God's throne room and to God's face don't just care about the rich and famous. They care about the poor and the needy and the downtrodden. They care about the people that nobody else cares about. And so the times in your life when you come along and you feel like your life is a waste, that you're not great, you're not wealthy, you're not powerful, you don't. Sometimes we get to feeling like the world wouldn't miss me if I was gone. God and his messenger angels care about you too. And in this case, they cared about the woman not because the woman was so special, although she became special. She became special because God made her special. But at the point this was going on, she was just a homeless runaway slave. And the reason the angels cared for her was because God sent them and said, tell her this. I can just imagine the angel saying, are you kidding me? All the things going on in the world that need to be dealt with, and you're sending me to talk to this homeless runaway slave that nobody even knows, nobody even cares about. She can't even get along with the people she lives with. I say, I don't know if the angels do that or not. I'm just saying I probably would if I was in that position, right? It's like God tells us that we're to take the gospel into the whole world. That doesn't just mean over to China. It doesn't just mean giving our money so somebody can go to India. It also means the person that lives across the street from you. And
God gave the angels choices also, just like he did us, so.
exactly.
I guess they could question him.
I guess they could. See, and I think they do. In fact, I think that's part of what's going on. We looked last week at we reviewed the God's heavenly counsel from the first part of the book of Job. For some reason, God chooses to work in community. He asks people for their opinion. He asks angels for their opinion. What should we do about this? Who should we send? What should happen about this? And some will say this and some will say that. Same thing true on the earth. We're part of God's people. We are part of his, quote, heavenly council because we've been adopted into his heavenly family. And there's times that he asks us, what do you want? What do you think? How should we do this? This is what I want done. How should we get from where you are to here? And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing to see how God, for some reason, chooses to do that. And you see that with this angel encounter. Anything else anybody want to bring up before we move on?
I have a question. In verse 10,
Verse 10.
it says, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they shall be too many to count.
Yes.
Who's he talking?
That's a good question. Anybody know? Who are the descendants of Hagar and Ishmael? Pretty much the Muslim world. Can you count them? No.
So is the angel making that promise?
God is making it. The angel is making it on behalf of God. God is telling this girl, this woman, you know, your master Abraham has been given this promise that his descendants will be like the seashore. God is telling this woman, I'm telling you, I'm going to keep that promise for this son too. Now, this son won't bring the Messiah like the Quran says. In the Quran, the son of promise is called Ishmael, and Isaac is called the son that was cast out. That's in the beliefs of the Muslims. But yeah, God is saying, I'm going to bless your descendants, and I believe that it was because of their connection to Abraham. This was Abraham's son. Now, he was not the son of promise. He was not the son of the promise. He was not the son that would bring the Messiah. But God's saying, in this sliver of the pie, I'll do for that boy what I'm going to do for his younger brother, when his younger brother is finally born. And we scratch our heads and say, wow, why would God do that? Think of all the trouble he could have saved in the world today if he hadn't done that. Well, we have to remember that this is a monarchy. God is the king. And we probably wouldn't have done it the way our king has done it. But he is the king. He can do what he wants. He can bless who he will. And even today, we see in the church sometimes people that you know from your family and from your friends, people that are really, really good people, but they don't go to church. And some Sundays you'll come to church and you'll see somebody that's a real yahoo, and they show up at church and you think, come on, God. And if you really study the life of the 12 that Jesus called, what a bunch of yahoos they must have been. Young guys in their teens and 20s probably. Is that the best you can do? Why would you do that? Think of all the trouble you could have saved if you'd gotten some better people with more maturity about them. But that isn't what he did. And for some reason, God says, I'll bless this boy too. And kind of makes us scratch our head. But the angel was told to give a message, and the angel faithfully gave the message. And
So they're just part of the Gentile, because there was Jews and Gentiles.
Right.
So even though they're Muslim and just Gentiles, so they have
Right.
access to the same promises we do.
they do now.
Yeah.
They do now. But throughout history, there's been special blessings on those people because they were connected to Abraham and they were connected to God. And God said, how did a bunch of ragheads become so powerful in the world? That's an American talking, right? I mean, they can't even build and run cities. They destroy anywhere they live. They live in desert places, and many of those desert places used to be oases that they've turned into deserts.
I mean, that's what it says is going to happen to them in the next couple of verses, too.
Exactly. God says they're going to be, this boy is going to be a wild donkey of a man, which the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? The grandfather, father, son, there's family traits that run down through these families. And, it says that every man's hand will be turned against him, his hand will be turned against everyone. That's exactly what you see with his descendants today, as far away from these things as they are. And yet, that was God's message. And whether it was well received like it would have been to Hagar would have liked the message. I bet Sarah, when Hagar went back home, she probably didn't like it when Hagar said, God promised my boy would be famous too. See, the people of God don't always agree with God. We're sometimes hesitant to say that in polite company, but in our hearts, sometimes don't we sometimes question? And if you say, no, not me, I'm going to say, okay. Maybe you're the first person I've ever met on this planet. Maybe that is true for you. Angels faithfully gave God's message. And it didn't matter to the angel whether the people liked it or whether they didn't like it. God said this. Here it is. Do with it what you will. And that's what faithful messengers do. They don't speak for themselves. They don't inject what they think. They don't hold back. They just record. Remember the old cop show on TV? Old Joe Friday was just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts. The angels, when they represent God, it's just the facts. It's just the facts. And so look over in chapter 21 now. We're going to skip a couple of angel encounters and come back. But this is an extension of the story in chapter 18. In chapter 21, Ishmael has gotten to be an older boy. His younger half-brother Isaac has been born. And once again, there's conflict between the two mamas. And I would almost bet that the conflict was over which boy was more important, which boy deserved the most of Daddy's attention, which boy deserved most of the inheritance or the help from Daddy or whatever. The Bible doesn't say that plainly, but I would almost bet that's what it was. Down in verse 8, the child grew and was weaned. Talking about Isaac now. The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share the inheritance with my son Isaac. That's what gives me the idea that these moms were feuding over which one of their boys was the more important to Daddy. Verse 11, the matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. Now notice the different characters that start to be introduced here. In verse 12 it says, but God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to what Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I thought he had already promised Hagar that her son was going to be numberless and that they were also going to be famous. And They were also going to be powerful people. He did, but there was a special promise of the coming Messiah that you and I know about now. People then didn't know what you and I know. We know the rest of the story, and we can look back to this and say, oh, okay, I know what he was talking about here. Ishmael was not the one that the Messiah was to come through. It was not his lineage. It was to be Isaac. And so Abram's saying, look, God tells Abraham, don't let these arguing women get to you, man. Don't fret. My promise is my promise. Yeah, I made a promise to that boy and his mama in the desert, but I made a promise to you before I ever promised to them, right? Verse 14, early the next morning, Abram took some food and the skin of water. He gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. What's the difference between this time and the last time? Both times Hagar's leaving. What's the difference? She's not being rebellious. That's one of those threads you find all the way through the Bible, is that human frailty and human weakness and human mistakes God is perfectly patient with. What he's not patient with is rebellion. Samuel told King Saul that rebellion is a sin like witchcraft. Because rebellion is saying, I know better than God, and so I'm going to do it my way. And so that's what happened the first time. She rebelliously left her position, her place. Here she didn't leave on her own rebelliously. How did she leave? With the instruction and blessing of Abram. He gave her things and sent her on her way. There was none of this, I want my way, and so I'm going to hit the highway. No, see, that's one of the huge differences between these two chapters. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. Verse 15, when the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. Verse 17, God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, wait a minute, time out. Who heard the boy and who spoke, according to your Bible? God heard, and the angel spoke. The word angel is a job description, not necessarily a class of beings. Was this a pre-incarnation appearance of Jesus? I don't know, maybe not. But I do think that's interesting. God chooses to use messengers. Well, why would God do that? He was listening. Why didn't he just answer? I don't know. Why does he send you and I to be lights in the world? Why didn't he just light his own light? His lights are brighter than our lights. I don't know. God is God. The king is king. He's the monarch. This is the way he's decided to do it. And we can either go along or get run over by the train, but the train is leaving the station, right? It's just one of those little details. The angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter, Hagar? You mean the angel didn't know? The verse had just said that God had heard and saw what was going on. The angel didn't know. Is that why he asked? No. He didn't ask because he needed knowledge. He asked because he wanted to interact with Hagar. He wanted Hagar to think about some things, right? Why are you crying? This is the same being that asked a couple of chapters earlier, where did you come from? Where are you going? What are you doing? Right? What's the matter, Hagar? This is verse 17. Yeah. What's the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up, take him by the hand, for I will make him a great nation. Second time, the same promise has been made, right? God says it once, that's enough. That's enough for the universe. It's enough for reality. It's not enough for humans. Not enough for humans. And so why does God lower himself to say something he's already said once, to say it again? It's not because he's forgot. It's not because he wants to shout and prove he's God. He does it because she needed it. She needed to be reminded what she had been told by God before the boy was born. Right? So, then God opened her eyes. Now listen, see the difference there? You've got God hearing and seeing, an angel speaking, and now God is acting. What are we going to make with all this? I'm not sure, but just notice the details. God opened her eyes, verse 19, and she saw a well of water. You mean that well of water wasn't there before? And you could argue about this now, right? It's like, well, it was there and she just didn't see it. Or it was there, but God put some kind of a force field over it. Or there was no well, but God made it. I don't know. I would tend to think, because of what I know about me and humans, I would tend to think that she was just so upset. It had been there all the time, but she didn't see it. It took God's help for her to see reality. And that's what God's messengers do, by the way, is they help people get through the fog of hurt and fear and anger into reality and truth. When God's words are shared by God's messengers, lights are turned on and roaches scatter. Sometimes we're one of the roaches, though, right? Anyway, God opened her eyes. She saw there was a well of water, so she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. Well, this poor woman is at her wit's end. Why didn't God just give the boy some water? I don't know. Why didn't he just have the boy crawl over and get his own drink? He's old enough to make fun of a younger brother. I don't know.
You know, the New Testament tells us that the writings of old are there for our learning.
For our learning.
Our instruction.
Yes, writings of old for our learning.
She readily received the promise of the covenant made by her son, but now she's later, it's like her faith has grown weak. So my question is, do we sometimes get like this?
Ah, good question. Good question.
Hasn't God promised He will never abandon us?
Good question. God promised her that they would live and that the descendants would become great. But now life has gotten deep and troubled, and she's in the quicksand of problems and life and fear and anger and frustration. Has her faith wavered a little bit, maybe? Does our faith ever waver? Jesus says, I'll never leave you or forsake you, but sometimes we say, well, where's God? Why did He let this happen to me? Of course we do. The problem is not God. Promises don't have to be resaid because God needs to re-say them. It's not like He's got a form of Alzheimer's where you have the same conversation with Him over and over and over and over again. No, God re-says His promises, and God interacts with His people because, as the Bible says in other places, He knows our frame, that we're just frail. He knows that we're just made from the dust because He made us. And so I believe, this is Rick Janelle talking now, this is not the text, I believe that instead of just dropping something in her lap, I believe there's something for her to gain from having some skin in the game. If God had just dropped a water bottle in her lap, which, by the way, He kind of did with the angel and Elijah, right? We'll talk about that later. Elijah had the contest at Mount Carmel, and God took him on a trip, and He sent a raven to feed him and sent him some water. All right. See, God could have done that here, but God is king, and God chose not to do. He chose to provide for her, with her doing some of the legwork. She had to get up when she didn't feel like getting up. She was on her last leg, but she had to get up anyway. She had to go and get the water. She had to give the water to the boy. Well, that's not fair. She's been mistreated. Okay. But God is God. And His messengers do what He sends them to do, but His true messengers don't do more than what He sent them to do. And, yeah.
Ishmael would have been somewhere from 15 and 17 at this time.
Yeah, 15 and 17 is the... yeah, he's not a little bitty boy. Some mamas think their 15-year-old boys are still little boys, but they're not.
When my
Yes, God didn't say life would be fair. He said it would be worth it. Another phrase is, God didn't say it would be fair. He said he'd be with you. There's a difference. He didn't say it'd be fair. He said you could take it. He didn't say it'd be what you want. He said it would be what you need. Right? See, we get these things, and sometimes we have to get shaken out of our doldrums, out of our despair, out of our sadness. Sometimes we have to actually physically get in the game before our mind starts functioning like it should have functioned all along because of the promises that God's already given us. And I think this is Rick now. You can disagree if you want to. I think that's what's going on here. That's what's going on here. Verse 20. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert, became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. And that's the end of that angel story. And then just like all these angel stories, if you're like me, you've got more questions that you've got answered when the story's done. Like, wow, why did he do it that way? And what about this? And what about that? And we peeked under the curtain a little bit, and the curtain came back down. Here's one thing that I learned from this, and you can tell me if you learned some other things. As powerful and as important as angels are, and as interacting with humans as they are, angels will not do for you what God has called you to do. They'll help you. They'll protect you. They'll help provide. Angels won't do your job for you. Somebody else got something we can learn from this, about angels from this? I've got one more little aspect.
This account of the angel appeared to occur, the angel in this version, New King James Version, the word angel is not capitalized. It was before she got it.
And in the original manuscripts, none of them were capitalized. So it's a question of what do the scholars on that translation committee think? Is it a proper name, so in English it needs to be capitalized? And so that's why you'll read different translations, and sometimes there'll be a capital letter, and sometimes there won't. But once again, it's just kind of one of those head scratchers, you know. Yeah, right.
In this second account here, it shows that the angel doesn't have to be seen either. It just has to be heard.
There you go. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point. Angels don't always show themselves. Sometimes they just speak. That's a good point. That's a good point. Anybody else?
One of the things I was thinking is, I think a lot of times we do get like Hagar. And we have a song that we sing in the church, Count Your Blessings.
Right?
Count them one by one.
Count your blessings, count them one by one.
Low, a good thing to do is to start counting your blessings.
Yes. Yes, there's that passage that said God inhabits the praise of his people. And it's not that God only lives in the words of praise. It means that when we praise, we become more conscious of his presence in our life. Once again, the problem is not God. The problem is us. And when we don't count our blessings, when we do lose our faith, many times it's because we're focusing on the things we didn't get as opposed to the things we did get. We get to focusing on the things that are hard rather than all the things that could have been hard but aren't.